So welcome to this first panel after the initial session by Enrico. Thanks for being here, and thanks for entrusting me with moderating the session on how can transatlantic cooperation drive a greener and more resilient future. So you see the topic is setting the scene, and we have a team of very complementary profiles to handle the topic today. We will be together until 12. So what I suggest is to have a first round of preliminary remarks from each of our speakers. I'll tell you how we'll do it. And then you'll be given the floor for questions and we'll interact like this. We don't have that much time, so we'll try to be sharp and to the point. Let me introduce the speakers here today. We have Vishal Agrawal, who is at the chair in sustainable business and professor of operations management at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. Anne Pollard, to my right, she's the director of the Economy and Environment Department at the OFCE here in Sciences Po. Philippe Kearns, who was the Chief Investment Officer at Shaw Investment Management. So you see already the different profiles that are coming up, and that will be giving more, more policy-oriented, more finance-oriented elements. And then Mark Ringel, who is the chairholder at the European Chair for Sustainable Development and Climate Transition at Sciences Po. Right, so I won't start on the very specific topic that each of them will cover, but I think the path will be like this. Anne will start by giving you an overview of the policy environment, elements about the optimal policy mix for those policies that will help us to go green, quote unquote. Then I'll give the floor to Mark for a more focused discussion on the Green Deal in the context as well of the European elections that are upcoming. Philippe will then take over, making the link from this policy sort of background to the more concrete finance and market developments. And then Vishal will close the first round of remarks by giving us a more business-oriented, more micro, firm-level view of the implications of what we will have discussed up to then. So without further ado, as we say, give the floor to Anne, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Thank you for the organizer for having me today. I'm going to try to talk about the compatibility of policies that are implemented in the US and in the EU towards making both economy greener. But before I start saying anything about these two schemes, I must say that regarding energy and climate policy, we are in a much, much better situation today than we were 5 years ago. Both countries, both economies have taken big steps toward finally taking seriously and trying to make things better regarding the CO2 emissions. Okay. Sure, everything is very complicated. There is a lot of uncertainty. There is competition between the two blocs, but at least policies are being implemented, and we can legitimately hope that we will achieve something together, okay? Maybe not to limit global warming to 1.5 degree, but maybe 2 degrees or 2.5 looks achievable. This is not very good, but it's not as bad as we could have thought some years ago. So now in the details, I have to remind you that to achieve the net zero emission target, we need to work on both the supply side and the demand side. And the supply side is not only the industry and people that produce, but you are also the supply side. Okay, when you heat your house, depending on the technology you use, you are supplying. You are also a supplier. And then so we need big change. We need large investment, large expenditure in R&D. To achieve supply side net zero target. But we also need something on the demand side, and on the demand side it's not only household, but it's everyone, also enterprises, and we need CO2 and energy sobriety. And this is really important. Without sobriety, energy sobriety, we are not going to be able to achieve that. I'm not going to talk about sobriety. This is something that is already in the mind of a lot of Europeans, not so much in American minds. That will come. So what is sobriety? Sobriety is energy sobriety, the fact that you use less energy without having to invest, to make any investment. So for example, you fly less. So you can still fly, but you fly less because instead of going every other weekend, you go once or twice a year. Okay. So you can also reduce your meat consumption. Okay. You don't need any big investment for that, but that will help the planet. So I'm done with sobriety. This is important, but this is not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk more about the supply side. And we have to organize ourselves to make sure that investment and R&D spending that are needed to achieve the net zero emission are actually showing up. Okay, it's not going to happen only by letting the market works. We need something else, and what we need is policies. And the good news is that these policies start to be implemented. Now I'm taking my economist view, a theorist, okay? And there is some research that has been done, theoretical research that has been done, and that showed that the best mix of policies is a combination of carbon tax, yes, carbon tax, I say it, and subsidies, okay, for investment in clean technology and clean investment. The two instruments, the two tools are probably needed, okay? Not all economists agree with that. Okay, some economists say, okay, carbon tax can do the job itself. Some people say we need the two, okay, to make the thing go faster. Okay, nobody, not a single economist, say you can achieve that with only subsidies. That's not going to work. That's not big enough. Okay, so the mix of carbon tax and subsidies to research and investment in green energy or energy efficiency is the best mix at the global level. Okay. Also, the research has shown, and I'm not going to talk much about that, that the faster we act, the better. Okay. Of course, the optimal mix is not perfect, and it is optimal on the paper, but it has some problem. People don't like carbon tax. So this is a problem for every policy maker, how to implement a carbon tax. That's the first problem we have with my policy mix. The second problem I have with my policy, the policy mix, the use of the two tools, is that no matter what, okay, doing the transition, no matter how we do it, is going to be costly in terms of economic growth. I'm not saying that we are going to, the GDP is going to reduce, but I'm saying that GDP, because of transition to green, is going to grow not as fast as before. And my own calculation, which I don't trust 100%, but my own calculation is that during the transition, during now and the moment we achieve the net zero target, okay, we are going to lose 0.3% of GDP growth per year. That's not much. But if you compound that, after 25 years, if my calculation is right, it's 10% less in GDP. Okay. Okay, now what are the US and the EU doing? The EU doing is having something that is quite close to the optimal policy mix. Okay. Why? They have carbon tax. People don't really realize, business do, but household may not realize that there is a carbon tax, which is the ETS scheme. There are incentives. There is this European Green Deal, and I hope Mark will say more on that. And that has been and is being complemented with a border tax, which is known as CBAM, okay, carbon border adjustment mechanism to compensate for loss in competitiveness that comes from the carbon tax. In the US, one tool, mainly, maybe I'm wrong, but it's mainly one tool. This is tax credit, only tax incentive, and it's big, okay. Then I can say one word about China. China is only subsidies, and it's not as clear as what we have in the US. At least the US we know. In China, we don't know exactly what's going on. Okay. So if I want to compare the two schemes, first I already said the EU is the one who is doing the right thing. Okay. Tax and subsidies. Well, sort of. Okay. It's difficult to compare the size of the subsidies from the US and from EU because the form is not the same. Okay. And plus there is no cap in the amount the US is going to spend on that, so we don't know yet how much it's going to be. Okay. One thing is certain is that in terms of accessibility, there is probably or maybe a problem with the way the EU is functioning. You have to send application, and the process is more complicated than just claiming tax credit, as it is the case in the US. Okay. This divergence in policy makes everything less efficient for everyone. Okay. Maybe, but maybe not, the EU will lose compared to the US, or maybe not, the US will lose. We don't know exactly what is the situation. Okay. The EU has one problem. There is the risk that researchers and fundings are going to move from EU to the US. I'm not talking about economic activities. The CBAM is more or less, will do part of the job to insulate the EU. The problem is the fund and the researchers. Okay. So the economic consequences are not clear. China is another problem. It's more a problem for, in my view, for the US than it is for the EU. Okay, then there is the danger for the US is also that they have a twin deficit. I mean, I feel like I'm talking 20 years ago or 30 years ago when we were talking about the twin deficit in the US, the large trade deficit combined with a very large fiscal deficit. The danger for the EU is to lose the innovation race. It's no longer about competitiveness, it's about innovation. And I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That makes a nice transition to the Green Deal view and the context of the European elections.
Yes, thank you very much, Anne, for the nice introduction and the nice framing. So zooming in to Europe, I don't know if you realize, but for the last almost 5 years, we've been living in a sort of real-life experiment. And that experiment is called the European Green Deal. The starting off is easy. I mean, the European Commission united with the member states proclaiming that by 2050, Europe should be the first carbon neutral continent in the world. So full decarbonization by 2050. That alone is interesting because at my time, 10 years earlier in the European Commission, I mean, we run scenarios and we run actual estimates. And what we found at that time was we could do minus 80% of carbon reductions. Doing more would actually be too costly. I mean, the opportunity cost, going for the economics of it, would just be too high. So suddenly you had a European Commission who was taking a totally different strand and saying, well, no, we go for it. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not a question anymore. We need to go for it for obvious reasons. Of course, this will mean that we need to transform. This will mean that we will face costs. But this European Green Deal is not an ecological strategy. Actually, it's a growth strategy. It's a growth strategy in the long run because by transforming, by doing that transformation, we'll be the sort of first movers on a global scale. We will develop the renewable energy technologies, the energy efficiency technologies, and the likes, and sell it off to other constituencies. So that was the sort of experiment that actually we've been taken on, and also sort of intellectually sort of translated into policies. So after the big target, which was, I mean, the easiest one, I mean, that's what politicians love to do. You give a target 2050, I mean, it's fine. They'll all be out of office. Great. But then really sort of toning that down into a midterm target, 2030, we will be around. Loads of us will be in the room still. Very ambitious target of minus 55% in emissions, and then turning that into regulations. First of all, energy regulation, because energy is 80% of European carbon emissions. So an energy transition for the continent is the obvious one. Renewable energies, energy efficiency, not sobriety, interesting. I mean, nobody dared to touch that. But then translating that, and that actually led what, I mean, we said Europe doesn't regulate for regulation. Well, the actual implementation across all sectors which you need actually led to, I mean, 54 legal proposals for European regulation. So it was, I mean, some in the European Parliament called it a tsunami of regulation sort of overrunning the continent. But that is just what you need in terms of transforming each and every sector, be it agriculture, be it energy, be it mobility, to actually get the thing in place. And which is in the make, and I mean, doing the regulations is usually time consuming. I mean, very hard in terms of fighting for targets for renewable energies, level of ambition for energy savings, etc. So that alone is massive, but it worked to a certain extent. So first point, you can do it. What's in for transatlantic cooperation? All of that, or many of that, is not intellectual property right. Shame to say it, but we just stole it quite a bit from the US. So pretty many of these policies are intelligent copy-pasting from US, well, most state law on wind energy, whatever, sort of intelligently copy-pasted over to Europe, which means that, of course, copy-pasting it over back to the US, if you find that interesting, would be an easy one, would be an interesting field for here again cooperation. So that's the first point. Second point, COVID, Russia. We had loads of crises where actually, I mean, the political focus shifted and rightfully shifted to other domains. Here again, this European Green Deal of doing transition and transition management, trying to channel funding into this transition actually worked pretty well to sort of stabilize these crises. I'm not saying getting out of it, but stabilizing. So when we had actually the question on dressing up recovery plans, public spending, well, should the money go to? Well, actually, the plans were already in the pockets, because you would say, I mean, go for digitalization, go for energy, for the energy system, transformability, and the likes of it. So there was a plan to it, which got us stabilized. So that's the sort of stabilizing argument. Russia, Germany, so I mean, gas crisis as we had it in the country. How do you decouple from that? Here again, the Green Deal gave answers. So suddenly this ecologic strategy, climate strategy, was suddenly a strategy of energy security. So here again, it was quite an interesting piece of legislation in terms of getting it in place, putting it on, but still at the cost of, I mean, being extremely tough on the regulatory stance, being extremely into discussions for each and every of these boxes, here again, energy, climate, mobility, in terms of transposing that, implementing it into real action. So that's the challenge, and with the upcoming European elections, we've been hearing probably a swing to the right. We've been entering a debate on, you know, is it too much regulation? Is Europe sort of dumping on us? So to be seen after the elections in June, what will be the future of this European Green Deal? Will it disappear? Will it not disappear? My personal judgment, and I'm stopping on that by now, is probably not. I mean, because there is no real alternative. I mean, there will be some other wording, I'm pretty sure of that. I mean, European Commission loves to redo all things in new sort of framings, so it will be probably green industrial strategy, but there is no alternative to this transformation. And going out to the transatlantic side of it, our transformation, joint transformation, US, EU, because it gets us better together, it gets us not the ecologic side, but also resilience in all aspects. And that is, I think, the interest of it, but stopping here.
Thank you. Interesting to see this long-term growth perspective on the whole plan. Give the floor to you.
Sure. Thank you. So I'll first start with some numbers. The world is currently emitting 59 gigatons of CO2 equivalent every year. Right? 36% of that comes from energy sources, 40% comes from agriculture and industry. There's some transportation, there's buildings, and so on and so forth. So they're the raw numbers. of the 36% that comes from energy transformation, we've basically solved that problem, right? We have solved that problem. Now, to reflect your point, we have to go there faster, but we have the technology, we know exactly what to do. So why do I say we've solved the problem? It's because the cheapest way of building plants to generate electricity right now is renewables. Almost anywhere in the world, right? The levelized cost of energy of gas and coal and so on and so forth are, for the most part, higher than renewables. So that's the good news. And the good news is that like 75% of all, over the last 2 years, all new plants built to generate electricity have been renewables. Right? The bad news is that still 80% of power is generated from fossil fuels. Right? So we're getting there, but we're not getting there fast enough. And the European Green Deal and the IRA, they are pushing through subsidies in the US. They are pushing that investment even faster, which is good. That's what we absolutely have to do. So I sort of think of that as being something that, we know what to do, we just have to do it and we'll get there. There are policy moves that both European and the Americans can take to speed it up even faster. Right? If you think about the permitting process, in China it takes 1 year to go from concept to a producing solar plant, solar field. In the US and Europe it takes multiple years, 4 years sometimes. Offshore wind is even faster, even sort of a bigger delay in the US and in Europe. It takes in the US something like 12 years from idea to actually production of an offshore wind plant. In Europe, it's something like that. It's a little bit less. The Europeans have made much more progress in streamlining the permitting process. In China, it's maybe 3 years. Okay, so there are policy moves that we can take in both regions, both the Americas and the European region, to speed up the transition even further in the sort of electricity generation and the power generation aspect of things. And then there are other sort of, some other things you have to think about, and that is like transmission of electricity from where it's generated. So in the US, for example, we can put in a whole bunch of solar panels in Texas and Oklahoma and these places where it's like really sun shines a lot. It's all photovoltaic, which requires sunshine to actually work. A lot of the demand is obviously in the Northeast and so on and so forth. So we need the transmission lines to get the power from where it's generated to where it's consumed. And that requires legislation, and I think Europe probably has the same sort of deal in some sense, that you can generate in Spain, but you need the power in Hamburg, whatever it is. And to get it there, the transmission lines have to be built, and that requires legislation to sort of maybe eminent domain, but other ways to get through the sort of rigmarole of building the transmission lines. So there are those things that have to be done. Speed up the permitting process in both regions. Remove some of the impediments from sort of the construction to the delivery of where the consumers are. The thing that is sort of the big deal in my mind is not the sort of power generation, but the other side of things, industry and agriculture. So those sectors combined are worth, they emit something like 40-odd% of CO2 equivalent. Some of that is nitrous oxide, some of it is methane, and as we know, methane is like 30 times worse than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. We've made so little progress there. Soon, they will be the biggest, those two industries combined will be the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. We've made so little progress there, and to me, that's sort of like, that's the big nut that we have to try and work on. And it's a mixture of policy and markets and so on and so forth. If you think about how we actually did it in the energy sector, as our panelists have noted, there was sort of skunk research or sort of first stage research done, promoted by the governments. There was a lot of subsidies and so on and so forth. And then the markets took over. So the technology was developed, and then the markets took over. And physics works for us here, right? There's something called Wright's law. You've all probably heard of Moore's law about the increase in computing power on chips. There's something called Wright's law. And renewables are happily one of the only industries that is actually proven to be sort of subject to Wright's law. And that is, the more you build of something, the cheaper it gets. Right? We've seen this in things like automobile manufacturing and so on. Renewables is one of those markets where it's actually the case as well. So you start building these things, and they're very expensive, and the skunk research is done. We understand the technology, and then the markets take over, and it's like this tremendous competitive aspect of markets in both the US and Europe, pushes down the cost of production for these. And that's why we're at the stage now where renewables are actually the cheapest form of new plants. We have to do the same thing in industry and agriculture, right? So you think about agriculture, it's you know, we eat a lot of pork and beef. You know, they're terrible sort of methane emitters, the poor old animals. Fertilization of the fields, so the clear cutting of forests to actually, you know, get grazing land for the animals and so on and so forth. We need something like we did with energy. We need there to be government-sponsored research of ways of decreasing methane, nitrous oxide emission, ways of creating steel mills that don't actually use coal to have these tremendously hot plants. That is what is the current technology to sort of build steel. That research has to be done, and then that has to be then sort of, you know, given to the world, as it were, and have the market sort of compete it down to prices such that it becomes, these new technologies become the way of actually running industry, running agriculture, and so on and so forth. And that's the real challenge over the next, you know, 10, 20 years, is to get there, basically. I guess I wanted to sort of bring a couple of things in from left field, as I'm not American, but I live in America, as we say in America. And that is that there's a tremendous opportunity from the investing side of things as well. So in terms of these numbers again, public companies around the world, so the public equity markets around the world are like valued at $120 trillion, right? And there's like 10,000 public companies in the world that we can track, whatever it is. They are responsible for about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. So 22 to 23 gigatons a year. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for investors to actually put pressure on public companies to reduce their emissions. You can create so if you take like an index, like Marco was talking before about Enrico, sorry, was talking before about the the European stock markets. The Stock 600, I think it's called. That's the sort of the benchmark in Europe, and we have the S&P and the MSCI indices in Europe. You can in the US, sorry. We can create an index that is a low carbon version of those benchmark indices, where the emissions of those indices is like 60% of the benchmark. Okay. If you can convince investors to invest in these low carbon indices, they're getting basically the same return. I mean, historically, over the last 15 years, the return to the MSCI Global Index, the low carbon version, is actually slightly higher than the benchmark version. So investors should be like, oh, that's pretty good, I can get the same return. And yet my companies that I own through this index are emitting 60% of the carbon that the regular companies are emitting. So some very back of the envelope numbers. If you take 10 trillion of that 120 trillion of public equities and you invest in low carbon indices, you can take out 1 gigaton of greenhouse gas. If you do, and it multiplies. It doesn't go up linearly, it sort of is capped out. But it's an opportunity for investors to sort of put some real pressure on corporations, public corporations, to actually improve their practices and do it. Now, why would corporations like that? It actually turns out that companies that have high ESG scores or low carbon, they actually have a lower cost of capital than their peers. Right? And the returns, realized returns to these companies has been anything slightly higher than their peers. So this is an opportunity for us as investors or regulators. Okay, policy, because it's a policy panel. What is the policy implications of this? One is the governments have to ensure and demand that there is good disclosure by companies. We need the data. We need reliable, objective data on what the emissions are that these companies are causing. Secondly, we need regulators of markets to put in place a regime where, if not, investors aren't encouraged to invest in these, they have the ability to do it. Now, the Europeans are way ahead of the Americans in this regard. Right? The European Central Bank has been working with the Bank of International Settlements to put in place a regime where investors more or less have to take this into account in creating their portfolios. Just Wednesday, so 2 days ago, the Federal Reserve in America declined to sort of do the same thing. So we have to work around that somehow. We have to sort of, rather than say, you have to take account of the carbon output of these companies, you have to be aware of the risks involved in not investing or investing in these companies that have like a big carbon footprint because, et cetera, et cetera. So when we frame it in that way, I think we can get to what we want, and that is to have investors sort of put pressure on all these companies. The other thing I was going to note was the carbon taxes and the cross-border carbon schemes. Interestingly, obviously, a carbon tax in the US, that's like the third rail. Nobody wants to do that. Like, there's such strong opposition. There is bipartisan support for a cross-border mechanism, and it's sort of framed in the US as, well, we have cleaner industries, so we want to basically penalize imports from other countries because, you know, they're hurting our industries by selling cheaper goods, even though they have like a carbon footprint like twice as big to generate that good, whatever it is. So when it's framed like that, there is actually bipartisan support for it. So I think that while a carbon tax, and I agree, it's sort of an optimal mix of policies, subsidies and taxes, I think if we can have the cross-border mechanism as a pseudo-tax or a way to sort of tax without telling people it's taxing, that is actually one way of actually getting America on board and having that sort of optimal policy mix. And I think I'm probably more hopeful about that than certainly, you know, a carbon tax per se. Anyway, I'll stop there. I'll sort of go on.
I already see some points of discussion on those policy tools and implementability of the incentives for investors to ban the corporate practices. Vishal.
Yeah, thank you. So many great ideas and thoughts already, so I'm going to try to restrict my comments and then go to some of the others. But I think I sort of work a lot at the level of corporations and trying to think of what it takes for them to pursue these, right? So a lot of things that the previous panelists have said are important things to start with. Sort of what Mark said, that in some ways doing the ecological strategy or the sustainable strategy is not at odds with financial performance if you have a long-term enough perspective, right? So a lot of corporations that I work with which have that perspective, even if there wasn't any regulations or incentives, would start considering these strategies, right? Also to Mark's point, the way regulations work, it's quite fluid across both sides of the Atlantic. In many of the other non-carbon emissions categories like electronic waste and things like that, there's a lot of regulation in the US copied from the EU, just very different from state to state, right? As you can imagine, California has way more sophisticated regulations around some environmental issues than, let's say, Georgia, which in some ways is challenging because when you're a corporation, many of them, or most of them, are not just based in the US, they operate all around the world. So they have to think of what the regulation is in the EU, what the regulation is in the US, and the US is quite a patchwork, right? So there's a lot of infusion of ideas and thoughts about legislation, whether it's incentive-based, whether it's tax or restriction-based, across both sides of the aisle, right? And in some ways, to what Philip said, a lot of the solutions exist, whether it's energy, whether it's agriculture, whether it's decarbonizing the buildings and the built environment. The challenge is, from my perspective, how do you get them adopted? Policy, whichever form it takes, is one answer. The other answer is solving the business problems. So most of the impact is created by businesses and or consumers. So if we need to get them to reduce their impact, we have to figure out what are the business challenges preventing those solutions from happening, right? One of the things that Philip just said, and that's been on the radar for me the most, is around disclosure type of regulation. So in the EU, obviously, if you're a company of certain characteristics, you're supposed to report everything, including Scope 3 emissions, right? Which means your entire supply chains. SEC in the US, after a couple of years of hemming and hawing, has finally issued its guidelines. If you're a publicly traded company in the US, you have to report most of your Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions. They didn't go to Scope 3. But I think Scope 3 and supply chains is where a lot of the solution lies in terms of harmonizing across EU and US, as well as across all around the world. So if I'm most of these companies or global corporations like the ones Philip and others have talked about, I have to think about not just energy, but agriculture, about consumers, about every part of my value chain. And then adopting solutions for those would require them to work across the world and across different policy regimes, whether it's EU or the US. But the biggest movement I'm sort of seeing in the US is a lot of big companies, maybe less so the smaller ones, are being proactive in thinking about what might be coming down the pike, whether it's in EU, whether it's in US, and thinking about how to solve the business problems to make that adoption happen, right? And so even in the US, out of the Forbes 2000 list, about half of them have carbon reduction or net zero targets. That is without any specific regulation in the US forcing them to do that. Sort of to Mark's point, not just 2050, but also with interim targets of 2030 and so forth. So that is the biggest sort of the dimension I see sort of channeling and connecting through all the panelists, what they've said. At the level of a corporation, how do I take those solutions that exist, find a way to actually do the job, actually implement them? And a very recurring problem is, one, getting the right policy and incentives in place. Two, getting the right solutions to business problems to make them effective and cost effective. And policy is one way to do it. The other ways to do it is through industry groups, through consortiums, through solving of the business problems that prevent that from happening. So perhaps one of the things I'll emphasize is where all of it connects back, as somebody who looks at value chains and supply chains, is the role of the supply chains. And there's other mechanisms which can help solve some of these issues, like the voluntary carbon markets. I know Philip has an interest in that. We can talk more about that later. But that's sort of where all of it comes together. Very fitting for today's discussion is sort of thinking about the value chains which stretch across the world and maybe can incentivize improvements along those chains.
Becoming local, is that what you mean? Thank you very much. I think that was very complimentary, as expected. So thanks. We're ready to collect questions. I have a couple myself, but if you have some thoughts, so you can think about it. I have questions about the sectors. You've all mentioned, the policy side, the regulatory side, the business-specific side, the incentives to investors. But what kind of difficulties or easiness, parallels versus contrasts across the Atlantic in terms of the main sectors that we are speaking about? All mentioned agriculture, mobility, energy. And we've seen in this country in particular, for example, with agriculture in the recent weeks, that things are not that easy, and policymakers might have an incentive to, with short-termism to make a step back. So what are your views on those sectoral developments?
I am not an agriculture economist, but for what I understood, even though we have many solutions for industry, for energy production, there are two sectors for which we don't have yet a solution to produce without emitting CO2, and agriculture is one of them, the other being airlines. And that's the two. So for agriculture, the problem is big. I don't know how to solve it.
Yeah, I'll say so. In the US context, a lot of companies that we as consumers interface with, right? A lot of companies which use a lot of agricultural products, whether it's clothing, food, and so forth, they have a lot of pressure to think about their carbon emissions upstream in agriculture. And the reason is because that's where bulk of their greenhouse gas emissions are. For example, some of them, it might be 90% might be upstream associated with agriculture, but it's not agricultural in the US or even EU, right? It's all over the world, and especially in other continents. And so one of the things they've been focusing on a lot, like Philip said, is looking for solutions to reduce those impact, whether it is improving yields around agriculture, thinking about water consumption, thinking about methane emissions. So they're looking for technologies which they can deploy upstream around the world with suppliers, maybe even 3, 4, 5, 6 levels removed, right? And it is difficult, to Anne's point. They might not even know who those people are. So what a lot of these industries are doing as well, I might not know who my tier 4, 5 suppliers are, but I might know where that production happens. So I'm just gonna go deploy solutions there. Maybe not exactly with the exact supplier I have, because who knows who that is, but in those areas of production, in those parts of the supply chain. And that is sort of the big part of the push up there in terms of agriculture especially, is to figure out how these big multinational companies can facilitate that. Very difficult to do, requires cooperation of the local governments, the balancing the economic and other considerations, which can be quite difficult.
Yeah, I would just add to that for some of these problems, for some small number of these problems, I think solutions again do exist. So, increasing crop yields, we kind of know ways to increase crop yields. Now, we can't, I'm not saying that we've got there like we have, say, in the energy side where we know exactly what to do. There has to be more research done on that to actually how to increase crop yields. But there are other things already where, one of the things that happens is that these are, the industrial size agriculture uses a lot of fertilizer, and it's just like willy-nilly spreading the fertilizer around, and that is full of nitrous oxide, and it contributes like 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalent every year. If you can use drones to more sort of target your application of fertilizer to the land, that can A, increase crop yields, and B, decrease the nitrous oxide by up to like 50% in some modeling. So I think there are some things already out there that can be done. But again, I think that an area for research, and this is sort of like fundamental R&D research, is on things like, how do we prevent the methane coming out of the basic cows and pigs? Do we sort of, and this is sort of like the sobriety comment that Anna made before, do we sort of convince everybody to start eating, stem cell-based meat-like products rather than actual meat? So, these are, that's a societal thing, that's a cultural thing, that's very difficult, I think, to make people, I like a steak just like anybody else. But I think that, there is research that can be done to sort of help promote these alternatives in this case, or to Vishal's point, to actually track where the emissions are occurring and sort of work with the end user or the initial sort of producers of those emissions.
Maybe just following up on the energy side, I mean, agriculture and mobility are the obvious sort of elephants in the room, which we need to address. I think my point, as we've been reiterating, I mean, we've got the solutions in the energy sector, we're applying it. I think my point here is political latency in terms of implementing these policies and business solutions. I mean, it doesn't have to be regulation, also creating business opportunities, innovation. And I mean, just to sort of highlight that, this short anecdote, I mean, you had the energy efficiency, actually, which is very strongly my research, and you had the executive director of the International Energy Agency really hammering out at one conference, we've got all the solutions, energy efficiency, I mean, energy saving, rephrase it. It's refraining from wasting energy. I mean, we'd be stupid to waste energy. I mean, with all of it, carbon emissions, infrastructure, so let's save energy. It's an obvious one. So we've got all, I mean, it's a no-brainer. We've got all the technology. All we need to do is implement. That was the sort of call for action. The problem I'm having with that is the executive director was Tanaka, and the year was 2007. We are seeing now, I mean, it took us an energy crisis in Europe to finally actually see energy reductions. And that tells you about latency in terms of, I mean, having the technology around, having maybe the business models around, but then really getting that into practice, which is nothing else but just a sort of call for, I mean, urgently acting on mobility and agriculture to just sort of shift it back to that, because we will see the sort of probably same, if not worse, latency in terms of implementation and working on the field in designing these policies or business models. Here again, reiterating and getting the market in.
That's clear. We have one question, Sergei.
Yes, I guess my question is for Mark, and it's about the elephant in the room. Being in France, I cannot not raise the question about nuclear energy. Here in France, when we look at the amazing transformation of German energy portfolio in 2022, when Germany actually moved to zero consumption of Russian gas, Russian coal, Russian oil, and yet continued to decommission nuclear plants. And I'm talking about within EU debate on this, but of course our American friends are also asking this question. It's great that Germany is buying American LNG, that's great, but why this huge tectonic shift of public opinion and opinion of the political class has not impacted the views of nuclear energy, which in France is considered to be as climate friendly?
That is a renewal, rebirth. Go ahead.
How much time do I have to explain?
Take your time. It's a big topic.
I think, I mean, partly it's sort of societal appraisal, which you find in sort of mirrored in the present government, certainly the Green Party, in terms of saying, well, nuclear energy is something which is not sustainable. So I think in contrast to France, if you were to sort of define the different debates, France is looking at carbon reduction, which is getting sort of nuclear on a very positive side. the German side would look at sustainability at large. So how do you treat unspent fuels, nuclear fuels? How do you store it safely and securely? And that is, I mean, the Germans still don't have any solution to the spent fuels. The country is probably more densely populated, so that, I mean, dumping it anywhere would impact people, which is creating strong opposition. And I think you had a very strong, but that's societal, I suppose. You had a very different appraisal of Chernobyl, the Chernobyl accident at the time, when I think France almost got that unnoticed.
We know the cloud stopped at the border, you know.
Yes, and I think that was the official version. No, I mean, so it stopped at the Rhine, and France wasn't impacted. In Germany, you had a whole generation of kids growing up, noticing it was springtime, and you know, you had all your toys outside, but you couldn't access it. It was a sort of COVID situation, pretty much the COVID situation which you had here in France, being locked in, not knowing what was outside. Was it dangerous? It didn't look dangerous. It was beautiful spring, and not getting that. So there is also a sort of societal side to that. That in combination is probably giving you a very different appraisal of nuclear energy than you have it. That said, also the nuclear phase out is not just switching off nuclear power plants, but it was, I mean, doing away with the whole industry. So in present Germany, you don't have any sort of nuclear engineers, nuclear chemists anymore, because they've left the country, largely. That's the story. So there is no capacity to sort of re-engage, which is giving you, in some of that, the sort of rough reasoning, I suppose, why they didn't do a reappraisal of the nuclear option.
Isn't it the case that when you take the full-in cost of starting from scratch and building a new nuclear plant and taking its sort of lifetime costs, including the sort of safe disposal of the decayed material, that it actually costs more than even a gas plant? Certainly more than your renewables.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, to me, that's why we're not seeing in most parts of the world new nuclear plants built. Certainly not in the US, and I'm Australian. I'm very familiar with studying Australia along those lines, and I think that that's why we're not seeing new ones built.
But as you rightly said, flow and stock are very different
Yeah.
analysis, right?
Yeah.
So one thing is building from scratch, the other one is decommissioning.
Yeah.
And the UK is in the middle of a big stock and flow initiative. You wanted to add something, Anne?
No, I'm not that pro-nuclear, but still, I mean, if I believe you, you said earlier that the more we build something, the cheaper it becomes. So I think for the new generation of nuclear power plant, that hopefully this will be the same. So maybe now, if you take the old cycle, it's more expensive, but if we were to expand on the same type that the one being built right now, that would help. But I mean, I'm not so much in favor of nuclear, so I'm a little bit sad to have to make this point.
Yeah, I actually don't know. I don't know if nuclear technology is subject to rights law as well. So I'm not sure if that's the case, that if you build more of it, it becomes cheaper. I can imagine there are some economies of scale, and there's something to that. But I don't know if we have enough observations, because they haven't built that many nuclear plants. So the empirical observations are. I mean, it's very hard to draw conclusions from like 6 observations or whatever it is. So I'd be very leery about doing that.
There were a few more in this country, but we have another question.
That was an exaggeration.
No, of course.
Yes, good morning. I'm co-president of the Georgetown Club of France, and my day job is in quant asset management. CCS and geoengineering. We're in France. We're able to see the incredible work done by Air Liquide in this domain, as well as startups. And then in terms of geoengineering, I was hearing in Australia they're looking at cloud brightening in order to protect the coral reefs. My question is, you haven't mentioned these 2 tools in the tool chest. Do you have any strong views for or against?
Sorry, just to be clear, geoengineering, carbon capture? Okay.
And carbon capture and storage.
Do you want me to go? Yes. Okay, sure. So if you look at sort of most modeling, if you like, and again, if I go back to my 59 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, we sort of think that by 2050, maybe 9 gigatons of that reduction can come from carbon capture and storage, right? So it's 20% of the solution, if you like. Now, at the moment, and there are two versions of carbon capture. One is sort of using natural, so using planting forests and stuff like that. And the other is sort of more mechanical, actually pulling carbon out of the air and doing something with it. And you have to do something with it. So at the moment, and there are two issues here. On the latter one, sort of pulling out of the air and doing something with it, it's incredibly expensive. Like we know from the European trading system that a ton of carbon is $70, $80, $90, something like that. It actually costs about $250 to $350 to pull a ton of carbon out of the air and store it. And we're storing it underground, right? We're sticking it in old salt mines and in salt aquifers and things like that. And that's fine. It'll probably be okay there as long as you don't put near a geological fault. It's okay. So that technology is there. And again, this may be one where, as we do more of it, we improve our sort of processes, and that technology will actually start to decrease in price and become a feasible solution. And that's what the modeling is sort of baking into this assumption that we can get like 5 to 6 gigatons from carbon capture and storage. On the other side of it, sort of the natural side, the issues here is that, sure, plant a forest and trees will sort of sink up some carbon, but we're always worried that those forests may be cut down in the future. And even more efficient than forests are kelp, so seaweed, mangrove swamps. So if we can build more mangrove swamp, or build, but if we can sort of grow more mangrove swamps and grow more kelp, they can actually sort of be incredibly good carbon sinks. But again, there you sort of worry about, we do that now, we sort of think that's great, we've sort of sucked that carbon out of the air. What if somebody does something? What if somebody builds a port there and rips out all the kelp or the mangrove swamps or something? 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road. That uncertainty, I think, is an issue, and we have to be sort of very worried about that.
So just to sort of add to that, right? So in the corporate world, the biggest buzzword right now is nature-based solutions, which is sort of what you're describing. A very small portion of that is planting trees anymore. Nobody's trying to do that. Instead, what they're looking at is other kinds of innovative technologies, like how do you manage your soil? How do you graze your cattle? And so forth and so on. That's where a lot of the action is, which is in some ways has less of the challenges with permanence, what Philip is talking about, whether that reductions will continue or not, or even measuring if it would have happened otherwise or not, which is additionality. So a lot of action in terms of carbon capture is around nature-based solutions. And what's interesting to me is a lot of that attention is happening around not to do it in US or EU, but in other parts of the world where that capital could actually sustain and finance a lot of sustainable development or a lot of sustainability strategies, including new technologies. So there's a huge amount of activity in startups, in technologies to measure these things, to implement these things like the drone stuff you talked about as well as finding new ways of doing nature-based solutions, which give us less uncertainty in terms of the permanence of these reductions and better verifiability. And those are, as long as we can solve those two challenges with each of these technologies, that's what would help with more of those solutions taking popularity. And I guess finally, that's somebody wanting to achieve those reductions, which a lot of these companies with upstream agriculture might do.
Yeah, just maybe picking up on the nature-based solutions. I mean, carbon capture and storage and geoengineering are always the sort of ugly ducklings in the room. I mean, certainly geoengineering, I mean, could go wrong. And carbon capture and storage, also from the European perspective, yes, we need it. We'll do it tomorrow, the day after. It's sort of pushed away. So in that sense, I think nature-based solutions are our first step, small piece of advertising. We looked, as chair, we looked into it and did a mapping of European and global projects. It's online as a working paper, or 2 working papers actually, because we also looked at the financing and the governance later on to get it in place and actually keep it in place, because that is the difficult one. And actually what you can see with these solutions is that there is a clear flora of solutions around here again, which are just sort of very experimental projects, front-runner projects, but really prone to copy-pasting. Here again, intelligent copy-pasting. I mean, not just taking one solution. Usually doesn't work to just take it and plug it somewhere else, but adapting it. And then you have loads of actually ideas, solutions, which you can intelligently copy-paste from one constituency to another, to give us these extra bits and pieces to work on. So here again, another transatlantic project actually identified.
Well, I don't know. I'm not I want to talk now because I'm not sure I will have the time to make my point again. Initially, I talked a little bit about sobriety, and according to the last report by the JEC, yeah, according to numbers available, sobriety, not extreme that everybody has to become vegetarian. No, you have your steak every other day instead of twice a day. That will bring us like 20% down the road. So this is the same as carbon capture, and we can do it now. You just have to change your behavior a little bit. So it's not going to happen overnight, but you can go long way with sobriety. Of course, this is not the only solution, and I am for all solutions, a mix of everything. But I hope that nobody would caricaturate again and again the points around sobriety. It's not that we have to live in the cave and with only candles and eating only roots.
I just want to add one thing, and this echoes the point just made, that to date, the investment in the mechanical carbon capture and storage has been like de minimis. Right? I mean, unfortunately, there are more fossil fuel industry lobbyists in the latest COP than anybody else, basically. And they're running around saying, fossil fuels can still be part of it, because we have this carbon capture technology and so on and so forth. There's been next to zero spent on that, next to zero. So it's very disingenuous to start with, but not surprising. And I think that, yes, it can be part of the solution. We sort of model it to be part of the solution. But I think, again, we need the research and development to be kickstarted. We need sort of an impetus. We need sort of, government policy to be like, this is something we have to do. Let's kickstart it, and then sort of let, the markets take over and let them sort of come up with the cheap solutions.
So just to sort of add to Anne's point about sobriety, it's difficult to get consumers to change their habits, but one way to do that is to nudge them. So I know a lot of big corporations in the US, especially when it deals with food, are making simple changes like plant milk is the default, right? So that simple nudge could cut out a lot of emissions in their supply chains by just influencing consumer behavior through that. So we need a lot of those solutions, like Anne said, which help towards reducing energy consumption or switching to better alternatives, which could be done at the corporation level as well, by thinking about that.
And 20% is not negligible, right? Yeah. I'd like to come back on this financing/investment side of things, because we are saying nuclear is too expensive and those things are too expensive and this is too expensive. So there's a bit of a tension between the argument which consists in saying in the long term its returns are positive, versus in the short term, it's difficult to induce investors to be full in the game. And we've seen example of large funds, turning a bit around. And here, I'd like to ask you about with this transatlantic comparative perspective, in a context which Anne touched upon when she said the US, twin deficits, public finances are not in such a good shape, public money might be spent very easily today, but what about tomorrow? Same thing in some countries in Europe. What's your take as to the optimal mix between public and private money in a sort of unconstrained world versus in a very concretely constrained world in the coming years? So that would be one question.
There is an optimal mix of public and private money. I think the actual mix depends on the industry, depends on the situation and circumstances, facts and circumstances. I think, if I take what happened with the energy sector, where a lot of the early research and development was sponsored by the government, there's something within the US government called ARPA, A-R-P-A, which actually almost came up with probably did come up with the internet, which we may have called ARPANET at one stage. But there's sort of this advanced research projects, what the other A is. Anyway, agency. Government must be called agency, right? So there's these entities within the US government that are charged with sponsoring, coordinating, subsidizing sort of early stage research and development on difficult problems. Problems that private companies may not do because they don't see the immediate return on it, or it's market failure in some sense. So I think that, in thinking about the optimal mix of public and private financing, it's sort of, there's a time series to this. And initially, it could well be almost 100% is sponsored by the government, or 80% sponsored by the government. And then as that research and development matures and the technologies get out to the market and they're sort of shared with the market, then it becomes much more a private financing sort of thing. So, at the end of the day, it depends what the policy objectives are. So even in the energy sector where, I've said we've solved the problem, yes, but we need to push it along faster than it's been implemented right now. And things like the IRA in America and the European Green Deal are doing that, and they are pushing things along. I think in the US last year, there was like 250 billion of private equity money that went into to build renewable plants, solar farms, wind power, and so on and so forth. The IRA is going to just turbocharge that. We're already seeing signs of that and it's mostly in private equity, interestingly enough. Signs of that in the private equity business, where it's not a direct, it's tax credits. And so to do the full accounting for how much of that is public and how much of that is private, really, it's an ex post analysis we have to do at the end of the day. But we're seeing sort of more and more private money flow into that sector. And I think that that's just the natural evolution of this time series of the optimal mix between them.
Yeah, I think you touched on what I was going to say, was like it's incredibly difficult to disentangle how much of it was public, how much of it was private. But your example sort of gives a good way to think about it. So I'm thinking about aviation, and you mentioned that earlier, right? So quote unquote a hard to abate sector, very difficult to sort of achieve decarbonization. There were some early fundamental research around sustainable aviation fuels and things like that. Slowly that moved on into individual airlines investing in it. None of that is commercially viable or cost effective at this point. And the biggest innovation, going to what Mark was saying, like how do you innovate the business model, is a bunch of these big airline companies are banding together to provide market commitments or seeding investment in this technology, which is not there yet, right? Which would take maybe another 10 years to do it, but would require private, public investment, fundamental research, all of that to happen, still leaving us with the question of how do you achieve that in the next 10, 15 years, or what are some of the other solutions? So I think in some ways the themes you're sort of hearing is you need both public and private, difficult to disentangle that multiplier effect, and can't just put all the eggs in that bucket of waiting for this commercialization of this technology or scaling it up, but having some other solutions which can be plugged into place until we get there. So almost requires, we have to look at every solution for each of these contexts.
There's, on this, just to close this subject, I think those examples you give for the US, this ability to finance through equity. I mean, I wish we had those 250 billion equity invested in such technologies in Europe. And that's really in the macro picture. We have this excess savings in Europe to the order of 350 billion, which is mostly invested in US debt, basically. While we would have a need for financing in equity of, I don't know, 50, 100. So this is really an imbalance that is playing against some of those adjustments we are dealing with. We still have 15 minutes, so if you have questions, yes, please go ahead.
Hello, I'm a student at PSIA. I study international development, and my question would be more about the consumption and like how the so what I noticed is that in Europe and in the US, the society is and people are used to very different patterns of consumption. We see that in this graphs where it shows that if everybody consumed as much as Americans, basically the world would run out of resources very fast. And I know that changing culture and changing consumption patterns is very hard, but and Europeans are, when compared to Americans, consume much less at the individual and households level. And I was wondering, although there are no role models if we compare it to the rest of the world. So also in a context where there is not only the US and Europe in the world, but there is also the rest, and the rest of the world, especially Africa, is supposed to be growing in the next 30 years. So we expect consumption patterns to rise. I wonder does Europe has also a cultural leverage? Is there an impact that the European policies and also at the cultural level are having on the US and the US society, on how the US is rethinking its models of consumption, of energy consumption, of buying consumption? Is there, do you think that this is happening, this influence is going, is also part of the solution? And yeah, so this is one of, this would be my question.
Who would like to start?
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
Get the US part of
Yeah,
the
perhaps
table,
that's
you
the
know.
most difficult question. So maybe I won't even answer it, but just like dance around it. Yeah, changing, that's difficult. It's also very difficult to tell countries or consumers in a country where they're just getting to that economic development to say use less. There's some positives, right? So as some of these countries are getting access to technologies, there's leapfrogging, right? So they are directly going to more sustainable technologies, obviously with a host of other issues. I have a colleague who's doing a lot of work around electric vehicles in South Asia, right? So there's a huge increase in transportation and vehicles, but it's directly to electric, right? So that's already sort of what I mean in terms of leapfrogging. So that's a positive, hopefully. And then the other positive I see is all around the voluntary carbon markets, which is where some of the work I'm doing, where that's a way of sort of financing that adoption of sustainable technologies in those parts of the world. How to influence culture or consumption pattern, I'm not sure if I have the answer to that, but maybe some of my other panelists might.
Okay, try not being a US citizen, I can force myself. I mean, I think the first point would be to that is that we always, as Europeans, tend to think that in terms of consumption patterns, whatever we can teach the US side lecture, no, they can teach us, and pretty much they did. I mean, in terms of, here again, sticking to the energy field, I mean, it was pretty much California, integrated resource planning, as it was called, in the 70s, which gave Europe the ideas of going into lowering energy consumption. So actually first kickstart into sobriety in terms of energy planning. So there is a mutual, I mean, looking at the other side and seeing what they're doing in terms of improving, and certainly you will see that, I suppose, as well in consumption patterns, which probably, but here again, an economist advancing now into sociology, I'm losing myself in all kinds of fields. I mean, with social media, I mean, our societies are becoming much closer. And you will see probably, rather than EU-US consumption patterns, you will see sort of social bubbles of consumption patterns emerging to some extent, which will give you, I mean, very sort of conscious consumers and some probably not conscious consumers. So that would be one other puzzle piece. Final puzzle piece, and here again, I'm sticking to my own field. That would be the positive effect of digitalization. Getting people aware, nudging, I think you already said the word, Vishal, in terms of having a default mode built into, well, staying with energy, into our dishwashers, into our tumble dryers, etc., of having the eco mode as default. You don't change that usually. 90% of people don't change the default mode. So just by using technology to, I mean, substituting for our sort of stupid habits, that can do a lot. Think of, I mean, smart homes, smart home applications. Yes, if you're running out, you might leave the light on because you're, running to catch the metro, whatever could happen, will happen. If you're running out of the house, you forgot to actually, switch off the light, whatever. You put the touch on your smartphone and your home goes standby. I mean, turning down the heating, cutting off the lights, etc. So that is technology substituting for our bad habits, in a sense. So there is a bit of hope in that.
I would just add one thing, and that is, unfortunately, I think there's a real dichotomy in American society between the red states and the blue states, or between the social groups, if you like. And I think that amongst certain sectors of the American society, some amount of sobriety, some amount of conscious energy consumption, conscious energy saving, and so on and so forth is probably an accepted thing to do. in some sectors of the American society, it's, you know, drill, baby, drill, and consume as much oil as I can because it's my right to do that. And I think that's you know, that's a real unfortunate thing about America, and it's actually just getting worse, I think. So I don't know what the solution is.
A mixed message from the panel on this topic, actually. I had another. I hesitate with my last question because it was a question of the net zero alliances, because we've seen across the Atlantic, actually, banks, insurance companies stepping out of those, you know, strong sector-wide initiatives. What is your take on this? Is that irreversible? Is there any way around it? Is that a problem or not? And I'm ready to collect a last question, but we are going towards the end of the panel. There will be another. Yes, please go ahead. Maybe you can ask your question now.
Hi, my name is Jesse. I'm a journalism student here at Sciences Po from France and the US, and I had a question regarding that whole consumption bit about the US versus EU. We're seeing a lot of companies from California moving to places like Texas, where I'm from. And as you're saying, there's more of a regional like diversity in terms of like drill baby drill or let's save the planet. I studied in California, I have friends in California, and they do not think at all like Texans, or Texans like Floridians, or Floridians like New Yorkers. So as we're going into an election, this election has global consequences, as we see with the little photo below the PSIA sign. How do you like see all the things that you're talking about? Are they going to change if Trump were to win? Because right now it's looking like Trump will win. And let's, you know, as the longer I stay in France, the more I become not negative, but realistic. And so if Trump were to win, how possible is any of this if we do, as the United States was founded on energy consumption and growth, drill, baby, drill, burn, let it burn? How is that going to change if our policies change depending on the presidency every 4 years?
Okay.
I'll collect another question, which is from the lady.
Okay,
behind.
thank you. So my name is Yana Malkina. I'm an independent researcher. So I would like to ask two questions, if I can. It depends. So first of all, it's just like we have been talked about common tax or carbon tax. Yes, for sure. What about the common nutritional standard, like conditions or for food? I mean, like, can I find the same food in US or Canada and here in France? I mean about the like ingredients inside. What we can do with this? It's the first question, and the second one is about more like this investments plan about in France for 2030, like the France to be a leader of hydrogen energy. So what we can expect and what kind of cooperation we can expect in this case. So thank you in advance.
All right, thank you. So we have a set of questions. Net zero alliances, US elections, the consumer tax / how do I make my way in this, and the hydrogen energy. So take a pick.
And you go first. You can choose this
Yes.
question or answer.
And she has to leave, so then I'll force her to leave, because otherwise she'll be late for her next meeting.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about change in preferences so that everybody will lower its energy or carbon emission footprint. I think the way to go is not necessarily to go by additional regulation. That can come from the people, from social networks. Okay, in France we have this experiment which has nothing to do with the carbon emission, but which is called a Nutri-Score, that informs you about the quality of the food you are about to buy. This is something that came not from the government, but were developed by I don't know which, by I don't know who, and it's becoming extremely popular. And now everybody, even the big corporation, they put their Nutri-Score, their score on the food they sell. Okay, so if we could have something similar, and it's very easy to read, and you know exactly what you buy. So I think if we could come with bottom-up solution like those, I mean, that could have a large impact. So we don't have to wait for government or big corporation to act. That can come from us, and this is probably also the way to go. So I would encourage you to be not, to participate into the effort and not to wait too much from, not to wait everything coming from the government.
I mean, maybe following up on Anne's answer, and that is now for the net calm alliances and well, US elections, I mean, putting them into one basket. I think the future solutions will not be governments alone. I mean, climate change is a wicked problem, and wicked problem needs multiple answers. And the multiple answers will, at all my good guess, not come from governments alone. It will be public-private initiatives, so not only net zero alliances of governments, countries, but net zero alliances of companies, individual groups, NGOs, combining, teaming up with, well, sub-national entities and forming alliances. So in that sense, I mean, and if you look back at Trump 1, if I may call it like that, I mean, you had in that period, I mean, many US states saying, well, okay, we have that federal government, what we're having, we can't change it, but what we can change is state policies, and that is why we are kicking in. And that is just the US. You could have many more examples around the world. So in that sense, trying to get the positive note here, notice. So in that sense, these carbon alliances will play an ever-growing role. They're here to stay, and that's for good.
So I guess I'll first speak to what may happen if Trump wins. The thing that worries me most about that, so I think that it's right that states have put in place and will continue to put in place sort of state-level rules and regulations and so on and so forth, which won't completely neuter whatever the federal government does. It does worry me a little bit that the IRA was passed with 0 Republican votes. So to the extent that, if Trump wins and if, the Houses of Congress go to the Republican Party as well, then you may see some repeal of that. The thing that sort of gives me some hope that that may not be the case is that in Trump 1, they actually threatened to repeal a whole bunch of stuff and they didn't do it because they realized it was actually good. And it was actually generating jobs in their own states and stuff like that. So hopefully, because we've seen all this investment in renewables and other technologies, that even if, at the top level, they're like, oh my God, IRA, blah, 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 effectively they won't do it because it is actually good for them, at employment in their states and so on and so forth. Maybe not West Virginia, but in a lot of other states. So that's, is that a hopeful note to end on? I don't know.
I was going to say, let me tie a couple of these threads together. But yeah, so to that point, like a lot of Republican politicians are already very happy about the jobs that are coming to them because in their states because of IRA. But sort of all of this, so for example, at the business school at Georgetown, I lead and helped launch the Business of Sustainability Initiative. And the reason it's in the name is that we really focus on how businesses look at sustainability. To Mark's point, when we think about net zero or carbon alliances, even in the previous Trump administration, through that, there was actually a renewed interest in the companies, greater interest in actually pursuing sustainability, whether it was because of increased state regulation or just an increased salience of those things. So in terms of the amount of engagement and work that was happening on that, sort of from my perspective, wasn't much of a difference. And to sort of Mark's point, that government's not the only answer. And the other way to sort of think of that might be that yes, policy does affect how much companies are going to do on these things. But at the end of the day, companies around the world are facing pressure from a lot of different, whether it's investors, whether it's consumers, whether it's NGOs, to undertake these activities. So in some ways, yes, it will make a difference what the outcomes of these elections are. But in some ways, the movement and the motivation that we're seeing at the corporation level for pursuing this is maybe not just that. And so in some ways, I'm more optimistic about all of that. And to your other question about net zero, there was a little bit of backtracking on that a little bit. And I think part of it is the challenges in figuring out how to implement it. And right now, where we are in the terms of the transition to net zero is grappling with the problems and how to actually do it, not just put those goals, but then how do you actually achieve that? And that's what a lot of the corporations and different stakeholders I'm talking to are trying to figure out. Okay, great, we put that up, but then we didn't know how to do it. So how do we actually now figure out the solutions, the technologies, the financing to actually make that happen? So in that way, at least at the corporation level, I'm quite optimistic.
Well, you know, it's incredibly optimistic, the messages that we're sending to the room. We have the technologies, balance, that's right. Regulation is okay, helping-ish, and we have lots of low-hanging fruits. Thank you very, very much for your contributions. Thank you for your questions. I think the lunch is still on its way, so yeah. Indeed, that's what I wanted to say. We free her up in any case, but thank you very much again. And the next session after lunch is at 1. Is that correct? All right.